Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so happy to have as our guest Dr. Joshua Rosenthal. And Dr. Rosenthal will be discussing mitochondrial health prescriptions. Dr. Josh is a dual board certified sleep physician and head and neck specialist who is dedicated to health and wellness. After a decade of seeing patients get sicker, he used his curiosity to search for explanations. To his surprise, he found publications in the world of biophysics that contain the body's divine secrets. And then he began to become an expert in understanding circadian biology. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Josh.
Thank you for having me.
And the best place to find Dr. Josh and his work is a beautiful website that is called quantumlifewellness.com. And we will have a live link to that as well. Don't write it down while you're driving if you're listening in the car. But if you're home, it's quantumlifewellness.com, or come to our archives and the link will be there for you. And what made me think about you, Dr. Josh, is that I work with Alex Lubarsky, and he has that great organization called the Science of Human Optimization. And a wonderful thing about that is it brings together a lot of the more holistically minded physicians like yourself.
Yeah, it's a great organization. I think what Alex is doing is fantastic. I think we certainly need to share all of our, unique knowledge because this is all kind of lost knowledge that exists. And the more we know, we can put together hopefully a new healthcare someday.
Well, I know, and the days are running along because I've been doing this since 1964. That's with a 6. And yet, and still, there's little teeny steps. I mean, when I started being a nurse, they actually said in mainstream medicine that what you eat has nothing to do with your health. That was actually the mainstream belief. And that has come a long way, yet it hasn't hardly budged at all in terms of any kind of advice or therapy that's given to a patient. They just say, eat healthy. That's not it. You need to know what's going on with that person. So it's similar with what you're talking about, which is really getting into the energetic essence and the electromagnetic human body.
Yes.
So what brought you to that? Like, you were regularly conventionally trained and you didn't learn anything about this stuff there.
Absolutely. In fact, I think back in probably my lowest grade in high school, I graduated third in my class, was physics, AP physics. The teacher was a tough grader. I can see his face and I won't call him out in case he's listening. But, the irony is we go through our training, we go through medical school, we go through our education, residency, become a doctor, and we have absolutely no exposure to physics and biophysics. And that's not the case in other countries. I mean, I use, some of the, Russia, for example. I know Russia's in the news, not for great stuff now, but Russia has a history of having a biophysics department in their hospitals for a very long time. And much of the research that I read came from across the pond in other countries where they've been doing this research for a tremendous amount of time. And this research is based on light, electromagnetism, and these are all physics oriented specialties that most physicians, no matter how smart and well-trained you are, don't have the chops and the background to really dig in and understand. And so my journey started just from being an observer. I mean, the wonderful thing about sleep medicine is it's very, very, I say this, I'm almost insulting myself, but it's very cookie cutter. You complain of sleep problem, I get sleep test tells me what's wrong with you. And to a certain degree, that is a very watered down version. And after years of looking at these tests, I recognized that only a certain percentage of people had a sleep disorder that I could diagnose. What was wrong with the rest of them? Because most of them were not faking their sleep disorders or faking their difficulties and their fatigue and their symptoms, right? So I started looking and digging into these sleep studies more in depth than I, was, trying to see if there was any common patterns. And what I started to see was a lack of dream sleep, a lack of deep sleep, a broken sleep architecture. None of those things I just mentioned, which can be found on a polysomnogram or, in laboratory sleep test, have a diagnosis that your doctor will give you. They're just findings, And I found over time that had to be part and parcel with some of the, complaints that the patients were having, because the client is always right. The customer is always right. The patients weren't making this stuff up. They wanted legitimate help. And I definitely did not feel satisfied saying nothing was wrong when clearly something was. And so, thousands of sleep studies later, I recognized that there were some problems, and I started searching for some of the answers. And to make a long story short, it really led me to a very simple fact that this was all driven by light. So I started trying to understand how light affected the body, and then how does light affect the cells? And that brought me to a very interesting organelle in the cell, a part of the cell called the mitochondria. And, again, in all of my $250,000 training and, almost a decade of education, you get a one line about the mitochondria. It's the powerhouse of the cell. That's what everyone's taught. That's the big, that's the big punchline. And that's all that's taught. And it turns out this mitochondria happens to be an energy and information transducer. It converts electromagnetic energies from the environment, light, etc., and it turns it into both energy via light and electrochemical energies, as well as instructions, biochemical instructions on how to run your entire metabolism and body based on the information. And it kind of gets us back to kind of Darwin and evolution. This is absolutely connected to why we're both standing, here or sitting here. We had to adapt to the environment, our circumstances of existence. And I think medicine has forgotten that. We call that epigenetics today, but that is, in fact, why food and the environment are important. They are the epigenetic signals that communicate to our body how to run our metabolism and our entire physiology. So it was a long journey, a lot of books, a lot of connecting dots that haven't been connected, but really just curiosity driven and trying to figure out why is everybody so sick? Because that's a question I think most people will want an answer to, and most doctors have none.
That's true. They just give them one drug after another, or certainly in your line of work being a sleep specialist. And let me introduce you at this time, Doctor. You are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and today we are so happy to have as our guest Dr. Josh Rosenthal, and you can find his work and more about him at quantumlifewellness.com. And we're talking about his specialty in terms of being a board certified sleep physician as well as a head and neck specialist. But he's gone much further than that into the electromagnetic and vibrational wellness, which has everything to do with health. And when we talk about sleep, I think most people, what they go to is, okay, well then if you have sleep apnea, you get a CPAP. And now all over the television is something else that people have, so they don't need a mask and tubes. And it's some kind of injectable device, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, in my practice, that's the main reason that people get sleep tested, to look for sleep apnea. And it's a growing problem. And one of the things, as a head and neck specialist, I look at throats all day and all night, and I'm quite expert at looking at throats. I started to actually become quite good at looking at a throat and recognizing their risk of sleep apnea just by the look and appearance, or what we call medicine phenotype of their throat.
So wait, let's do this for the listeners. Okay. Tell us what sleep apnea is, Dr. Josh.
Sure. So sleep apnea is a condition whereby during the night, your airway collapses and it can either partly obstruct or completely obstruct. And this causes a stoppage of your breathing and often is associated then with decreased oxygen to your body. And that causes you to then have an arousal, a micro waking up, if you will, to open the airway back up and let the air rush in so that you don't die of hypoxia or essentially almost self-strangulation. And then you fall immediately back to sleep. This all happens on a millisecond to millisecond basis. So you do this all night long, and essentially you are waking up multiple times to save yourself from dying, in essence. And this prevents you from having quality sleep.
Right. And it seems like so many people have it, but you're saying not always. There's other things, but they wind up getting that machine.
So most physicians will tell you that sleep apnea is a physical disease. It's an obstructive condition based on your anatomy. It's often associated with obesity, but not always. And one of the things that I recognized over time was that while I could, with a very high rate of sensitivity, diagnose people just sometimes by looking at their throat and recognizing they're at high risk, there were many people with severe sleep apnea that did not have the appearance that I expected to see. And so that was kind of contrary to what I would expect. Some of them were very thin people, so this idea of obesity and weight causing the collapse doesn't hold up. And part of me always recognized there was this anatomy thing was kind of a red herring and that there was some deeper cause. And I kind of believed that there was some neurologic cause. Made much more sense that the loops, the respiratory loops that are normally in place kind of lost control. And these are probably brainstem portions of your, sleep. And it turns out that there's a physician that published a paper, a prominent sleep physician. I think it's Dr. Malhotra. I apologize if it's someone else, but he put out a hypothesis that sleep apnea was a neurologic condition and not an anatomic condition. And when I read that paper, that resonated deeply. And this is, again, even before, I had made some of these connections. But again, a neurologic problem is an electrical wiring problem, which is a biophysical problem. So now, we're back to, if you destroy your computer system, you're not going to be able to manage your breathing at night. And so, again, when we talk about root causes, CPAP does not treat any sort of neurologic condition. It treats anatomy. And as you know, we're trying to hopefully get to a root cause to improve people's, health. And if you're treating a symptom, the root cause is left untreated.
Right. And of course, nobody's even looking at that. And so how would your approach to someone who did have sleep apnea differ?
Well, so this gets us back to, mitochondrial function and circadian rhythms, and which are both intimately connected. Ultimately, you have to recognize that I would say, you could go online into a search engine and type in circadian and whatever disease you may have or the listeners may have, and you'll find that there may be either clinical or, just bench lab type scientific research about this, studying the genes and the different connections. So almost all diseases connect back to your circadian rhythm, and essentially your DNA, which can make these proteins and enzymes and all the machinery to run yourself. Every gene has a pre-transcriptional factor, which is a clock gene. And pre-transcriptional means before it makes the donuts, it looks to see what time it is. And unfortunately, we live in a world where we've completely destroyed our circadian biology and our circadian rhythm. So we have no idea of what time it is. And just to make this simple for listeners, when we lose time in our cells, that chaos that's created could be simply called inflammation. And so I think most people who are listening and a little more holistically minded recognize that inflammation is kind of the root of all disease. And so this is a simple way where you can start to destroy the cellular function. And inflammation is kind of code words to get a little more geeky here, reactive oxygen species and things that destroy and rust your cells. And this happens again through mitochondrial inputs. It takes this information, and when it has chronic stresses, what we term in science oxidative stress, this basically creates an exhaust of damaging chemicals that then ruin your ability to create energy, run your physiology, make hormones, et cetera, whatever, wherever system is damaged. And this is all linked to, your clock that's running your body and your cells and your organs. And it's also linked to the bioenergetics, which the mitochondria are listening to your environment to help determine what to do. And we're giving it the wrong instructions.
And those cycles, the word that many people may have heard about it is called circadian rhythm. And it's also tied into the pineal gland,
yes,
which I'm sure is part of, what you're interested in. Let me just ask you this. How do you feel all these electromagnetic waves, and in particular the new 5G that has now been released recently, and they're already talking about 6G, how do all these things affect those natural cycles?
Well, I'll put it in the simplest way. Obviously, it's much more complicated science, but I like to use this example for both blue light, which is all artificial light for the most part, and EMF, which is generally man-made electromagnetic devices, because the Earth does have its own EMF, so not all light and the sun does have blue light. So again, it's how these things are used. But both of those suppress melatonin, and melatonin is probably one of the most poorly understood hormones in your body. It is not just a sleep hormone. It is one of the most powerful brain antioxidants. It's also an aromatase inhibitor. That's code word for it lowers your estrogen. And we all know someone with breast cancer and high estrogen levels are associated with cancer and cancer production. So we don't want to have unremitting estrogen in our body. So this is a major controller of those things. Even more importantly, it turns out that melatonin is part and parcel with the regenerative process of our mitochondria and cells. And so this means our ability to heal ourselves is dependent on the production of mitochondria and sleep, because sleep is when we make a lot of our regenerative processes go. So anything that attacks your melatonin is attacking your longevity, your health, your hormones, your brain. When you start to see that, you realize, holy moly. So then people would naturally say, oh, let's take some more melatonin. But it doesn't, unfortunately, work that way, because this is a very highly coupled, connected system. And just like thyroid hormone, you don't want to just take thyroid hormone if you don't need it.
Now, that's a very important point that I would like to reiterate, because when we're taking something like an herb, let's say astragalus, which is a whole plant, it has a lot of nutrients within it that might have a particular action, but it reacts in the body similarly to food. Very different when you take a hormone externally, and that's what melatonin is. And it does a lot of things that might be positive, but like if you don't need it, it can actually depress your body's ability to make your own because of that feedback mechanism. So how do you recommend, when to use melatonin, when not to use it? I think it's being over promoted, and it's being added to everything because it's a buzzword right now.
Yeah, I mean, my personal bias is towards natural production, because it's meant to be perfectly quantized, or the perfect amount being made at the right time by your body. And the way you do that is to honor your circadian rhythms, which are driven by light. So the first and foremost would be to have some morning sun exposed onto your skin and eyes, because it is that morning sunlight that first starts to make melatonin in your eyes. And then that kind of generalizes and gets sent up to your pineal gland at night to be released more globally. Now, night is only formed in the absence of blue light, at least from the standpoint of the body clock that we all have. So when you are staring at a screen, when you're staring at a TV, when you have the lights that are compact fluorescent or LED above your head at night, even if you're not watching a screen, that signal is telling your body that it's 12 noon and not allowing night to actually start. And it takes 4 hours of darkness to actually start creating melatonin. So you could see how we live in a heated box with artificial light, and we turn off the lights right before our head hits the pillow. And essentially that means that we don't see darkness until our head hits the pillow, even though it may have been dark for 4 or 5 hours already.
Or if at all. Because a lot of people have the television on the whole night. They have their clock, which has a light on it. They have the lights on the TV box, even if the TV is off.
The bad news is we have this blue light sensor called melanopsin in our skin, in our fat adipose tissue, and in our blood vessels. So leaving just a nightlight on can be devastating to your biology. And in fact, I remember just talking to someone whose child, a very young infant, was having sleeping issues. And they said, well, we have a nightlight on. I said, why don't you just get rid of the nightlight? And that was all it took to allow this infant to start sleeping through the night. So we don't recognize the power of physics, I think, as a group of doctors and as a society, but it's way more powerful than you think. And of course, you may sleep with your phone right next to on your nightstand. And again, this is a bidirectional device that's constantly communicating to the towers. And these radiations do suppress your melatonin. And that's not to mention the other effects, that have been documented, and, the frequencies that are being emitted and how those frequencies can affect you. So this is a very complex physics that, you really need to reconnect to nature. It's very simple. That's really the prescription as a kind of general rule, how you mitigate all the things in your life that you feel are impossible to live without. That's the challenge.
Now, can melatonin levels be tested like we can test so many other micronutrients?
So the answer is yes, but the answer is complicated. One is, since it's mainly propagated at night, its involvement usually is you'd have to measure, at night really to get the levels that you want. And the other problem is it's a circadian hormone. So, we look at a lot of levels as a single level, but really you want to know how that level changes over the course of the day. The test that's generally done is a adrenal salivary index, which is a cortisol test, which gives you kind of the opposite of melatonin, the circadian rhythm of its kind of polar opposite. And cortisol is high in the morning when you wake up and should be low at night when you go to sleep. And then, of course, melatonin is high at night and should be low or getting low in the morning. So a single spot blood test of melatonin is not that helpful. One, because you have to take the context of when it was taken. If you take it at first thing when you wake up versus you take it at 2:00 in the afternoon, what is the significance? It's very different. And then finally, the other part that people get wrong about melatonin is this is a hormone that is not just a global hormone, it's a local hormone, which means the cell, the mitochondria, in fact, makes melatonin in the cell with the goal of helping the cellular function in and of itself, not just your entire body and physiology. So that's lost on most even functional medicine doctors, that you need to make it locally, not just globally. And so the cell needs to make it. So it's very tricky.
And so then because even during COVID, there was a lot of doctors who said, well, more melatonin is helpful.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the things that made it go crazy in terms of everybody just taking it without knowing if they needed it or not, and not in a way.
It tells us is most people are melatonin deficient, if you think of it as a problem, because of the world that we live in is so artificially lit and mal illuminated. The illumination that we choose is attacking our circadian biology.
Well, I imagine in your practice, when you see someone, you not only explain this to them, but do certain activities to help them normalize all these very complicated functions so that in the end they get some more sleep. Absolutely.
And as you sleep, you improve your longevity and your health. And so it's amazing how many things change when you start to get these things right.
And what would somebody do if they wanted to start, let's say, to have a consult with you and see what's going on with them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people can can contact me and we can start by doing a consult to see what the health goals are and what they're looking to do. A lot of this requires changes in your lifestyle because, as I said, epigenetics mean that what's going on around you is almost as important as what you're doing yourself. And so, you have to be pretty motivated to change because the things that you've been doing made you sick. So if you're not willing to change the things you've been doing, it's unlikely we're going to have a tremendous amount of success without changing some of those, foundational problems. So,
well, that's absolutely true. In all holistic medicine, it's about education, but the person who heals you is you. The doctor can't do it. Dr. Rosenthal can do it for himself, not for you, but you could be the guide.
Yeah, so some people are just looking for the pill, potion, or powder, and certainly sometimes those can be helpful. But again, if someone who really wants to move the needle, these are foundational changes that have to occur, as you know, and it's a bigger commitment. So I really am only looking for those sort of motivated people.
So, Dr. Rosenthal, as you indicated, people have to create certain changes in their life to address these issues if they were coming in to see you for a consult. What are some of the changes that you would recommend? I imagine it's not the same for everyone.
Yeah, so we're looking to dissect your lifestyle as it applies to the electromagnetic exposures that you have. A lot of people talk about sleep hygiene. So, do X, Y, and Z before bed to try to help you sleep better. I really look at this as what we call light hygiene, is that the electromagnetic frequencies that are around you and that you're exposed to are going to be impacting how your biology really runs. And if you don't change those, you can only change your health so much. Yeah, I mean, it varies. It depends, if you're a shift worker and you're a night worker, at night you work, this is a much more difficult problem than if you work as a park ranger, right? So in other words, everyone's circumstances of existence are very different. And so, we are trying to craft a lifestyle prescription to, mitigate. Look, some people are not going to quit their jobs because their job's going to be a very high level of exposure of these things, but there are things they can do to mitigate it. So we have to really go through and figure a lot of these things out. The other part of that is helping to repair their mitochondria using a lot of different techniques to rebuild their mitochondria, which have been damaged from all these signals that we're talking about when they're excessive.
Well, thank you so much. What interesting information. You can contact Dr. Joshua Rosenthal at quantumlifewellness.com. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much. Everyone be well.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC at Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, send us an email at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai, at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.